Okay, this is an introduction to the lecture that follows. Unfortunately, there was some technical glitch, and I played some YouTubes, and the sound didn't come through on the video, and I apologize for that. But what I've done is underneath this video, I've attached links. They're all from the Webern Opus 21 Symphony. But I will give you the timings for each section. There's one that starts at the very beginning, then one in the sort of the middle of the first movement, the development section, then one at the beginning of the second movement, and one at the end of the second movement, the coda of the second movement. So if you can click on those when you get to those parts of this video lecture, and you can, of course, it includes the score. So if you can follow along with those, that will work, I think. Again, I apologize for that. I'm not sure why the audio for those videos didn't make it through, but hopefully this will work for you, and I think you'll enjoy this piece. Thank you. Final lecture for Unit 2, 12-tone serialism, and we're going to look at one more piece by Webern that demonstrates concepts that we already talked about in reference to the piano variations, Opus 27. Today, as you can see, we're going to look at the Symphonie, Opus 21 by Webern. There's a lot of things to talk about with this piece, but we're going to follow along with the worksheet that has some discussion in it. Let's do this. Okay. So, the Symphonie Opus 21. This piece is a bombshell on two continents. It effected the formation of the New York School when Cage and Feldman both met after a performance of it in New York. Boston Symphony was visiting and performing in Carnegie Hall, I think in 1950 maybe. And they were both, totally blown away. They met each other and they became friends, and Feldman moved into Cage's building, and then pretty soon they met Earl Brown and Christian Wolff. And then I also mentioned that Christian Wolff and Ben Johnston were some of Cage's only students. His first assignment for them was to go to the New York Public Library, check out the only copy of this score that existed in New York City at that time, and copy it by hand. And, that used to be a very common pedagogical tool, was hand copying scores. That's something that Bach did. That's something he learned a lot from, hand copying scores by Vivaldi, among others. And then, of course, this piece was introduced to Messiaen's students at the Darmstadt Foreign course in the late 1940s. Stockhausen's and Boulez in particular introduced to this piece. So this is the piece where we really get full-blown pointillism. You remember that we formerly had three kinds of texture in music that we've talked about: monophony, polyphony, homophony, and then an additional one that doesn't exist so much in classical music, heterophony. Well, this music, I'm going to show you a little bit of the score. Check it out. This doesn't really fit into any of those categories. Here's the boiled down version of it. And you can look at it. It's for two pianos here, but it's an small orchestra piece. You can see we don't really have melodies or harmony as such. We have little bits of sound here and there, and they resemble more, kind of like stars in the night sky or something like that. That was something that Stockhausen described his experience of this music. Let's listen to a little bit of this piece. Now, if you could get this page 78 from the Hicks packet, if you want to have it out, that would be useful. I will refer to this here and there, but I have this nice YouTube of the piece that gives us the full orchestral score. Now, a couple of other things to think about. It's called a symphony, but there are a lot of things missing. It only has 2 movements. This is 1927, 28. Think of the symphonies that had preceded this. Of course, the symphony, the multi-movement symphony came into being in the 18th century. We think of Haydn as sort of being the innovator, although it was before Haydn, it was the Bach's sons who kind of innovated the symphony. Started out having 3 movements, then it moved to 4 movements, which was kind of its format for a long, long time. Then we get composers like Mahler, of course, who kind of revived the symphony, who wrote symphonies of, more than 4 movements, expanded its scope, used chorus and soloists. Of course, Beethoven was the first one to use chorus and soloists in a symphony, but this is well established by Mahler's time. So this impetus to expand the symphony to be this almost kind of an operatic piece. And then we get this Webern symphony, and you can see right here, look, duration of both movements, 9 minutes and 17 seconds, 2 movements. And look at the orchestra, clarinet, 1 clarinet, bass clarinet, 2 French horns, harp, and basically string quartet. Sometimes this is performed as a string orchestra. I think it's done both ways, string orchestra and as a string quartet. So very small forces, short, and very, very transparent, sort of 1 note at a time textures. There's another term that goes back to the Middle Ages for musical texture that consists of single notes from different instruments or voices that result in a compound melody. That's called hocketing, usually with 2 performers. But that might be one way to look at this. I don't think this is hocket, though, because it doesn't result in a sort of a stepwise melody that we'd be familiar with. Again, I think pointillism is the only way to describe this. Well, let's listen to a little of this, and then we'll talk about it in terms of our favorite subject, 12-tone serialism. Okay, so the first page, we'll look at it with the full orchestral score, or if you can call it that. We might call this a theater orchestra. It's not even the size of a chamber orchestra, because we only have 1 of each instrument, but this would be a theater orchestra of that period. Okay, let's begin. Let's turn this up. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's pause there for a moment. And once again, we're looking at a piece that pretty much radically alters musical texture and presents really a different way of making music, listening to music, etc. One that was very influential. We find we're going to have at least a day on pointillism of the second half of the 20th century. This is written in 1927-28, but it really didn't become well known until after World War II, and that's when it had a big impact. So we have pointillism, but then pointillism ends up being a pretty short sort of fad, and then it leads to all these other kinds of music, ways of making music, because pointillism has liberated music from individual sounds or notes from being bound to one another in phrases or chords, etc. And so new ways of bringing notes together arise. Okay, let's listen to it again, but this time I'm gonna, if I can get this to work, this time we're gonna look at the piano score. If I can get back to where it was. Nope. There we go. Okay, well, let's blow this up a little bit. And let's listen to it again. So here you'll notice we have the row forms ready for us. And we'll look a little closer at those. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's pause there. Now, let's look a little bit closer. What we have here, similar situation in the piano variations. We have these inversion canons, and this has been presented in a way that we can see that. Here we have, but we have two separate inversion canons happening simultaneously. And there's so much airspace between notes that they kind of, it's kind of like a transparency and putting it on top of another image. They fit together quite well. They fill in gaps for each other. Now, of course, also because of these gaps and also these very wide intervals and the fact that we're switching instruments almost every note or every other note, we don't hear these as individual lines. So it's like these are hidden canons. But if you recall an inversion canon, this is like a round, except that we have a leader and a follower, but the follower performs the same melody, but with intervals going in the opposite direction, inversion canon. And this is in terms of pitch, not just pitch class. So here we have A going to F sharp, in other words, up a major sixth, and then going down to G, so that's a major seventh plus an octave. Okay, well, let's look at the follower, which comes in, like 2 bars later, which is different from, you remember the piano variations, the leader and follower were separated by an eighth note. They were very close together. Here is a more conventional approach where we've got, 2 bars between them. Here we start with A, same note. So these are both starting on the same pitch, not just pitch class. This one goes down a major sixth, where this one goes up a major sixth, down a major sixth, then up a major seventh plus an octave. Remember, this one went down a major seventh plus an octave. And let's see, where am I? Okay, then it down 13 semitones. In other words, this is an augmented octave. And this one also goes up 13 semitones, in this case, a minor ninth. Again, this is atonal music, so we don't care about the spellings really at all. Okay, so then this continues all through this page, which if you know about sonata form, this could be viewed as being like the exposition in a way. Okay, then this other simultaneous or, canon, of course, this one comes a bar later. So this one comes in first bar, leader, second, follower comes in the third bar. This one, leader starts on the second bar, follower comes on the fourth bar. So they're even sort of offset from one another by a bar. Okay, this one, different, starting with a minor third up, then a minor ninth down, and then a what am I doing here? Major 7th plus an octave up. Let's look at this left hand, I guess we could call it, starting on C sharp. Now these two do not start on the same pitch the way this canon does, but anyway, okay, down a minor third, down 3 semitones. This one went up 3 semitones. Then we have up a from this B flat up to this B natural, which is a minor 9th. Wait, no, yeah. Instead of this descending by 13 semitones, this goes up 13 semitones, then it goes down a major 7th plus an octave. This one, of course, goes up a major 7th plus an octave, etc. We continue on for this whole page. This is the logic. Now, we also look at the row forms themselves. Now, you remember when we talked about dyadic invariance. We're talking about dyadic invariance. You remember this is a technique that Webern liked to use. Now, keep in mind that in 12-tone music, the most common situation was to have 2 row forms happening simultaneously. That was, if we look at all the 12-tone music, at least from the second Viennese school, that's a very common texture. In this case, we kind of have that, except we've got 2 different events involving 2 row forms happening at the same time. So 4 row forms happening at the same time, but they're divided into 2 sort of sub-textures, as canons, as we discussed. So this idea that Webern wants to have certain pitch classes associated with one another in order to create this canon. So in other words, here we've got this A against an A, F sharp against a C, G against a B. You'll notice they're all, if we take these pairs from each of the canonic voices, they're all equidistant from this A, A3, the one that's a minor third below middle C. Every single note in this canon, its partner from the leader to the follower is equidistant in either direction from this A. Same thing with this here. We start with this F, which is 8 semitones, or what am I saying? 4 semitones below this A. This one's 4 semitones above. This one's 1 semitone below. This is 1 semitone above, etc. Okay, so it's making everything symmetrical around this axis of this A, A3. So in order to make that work, he has to consistently have certain pitch classes paired with other pitch classes, no matter what 2 row forms are being used. So he says, okay, well, the way to do that is I always have inversionally related row forms, P and I. It could be R and Ri, but he always chooses P and I. In this case, P0 and I0, I8 and P4. Well, what do these row form pairs have in common? What do P0/I0 have in common with I8/P4? Well, their transposition numbers, they're both PI pairs, and their transposition numbers add up to 0 or 12, because 12 equals 0 under mod 12 arithmetic. 8 plus 4 equals 12, which equals 0. 0 plus 0 equals 0. Okay, we go to the next row form pairs. Here's I3 and P9. 9 plus 3 equals 12, which equals 0. And then here we have 5 and 7. 5 plus 7 is 12, which is 0, etc. Okay, and I've represented that here in this little biz here. Yeah, just, this little paragraph talks about that. Okay, now let's look at the row itself. A couple of things to think about. Again, some people might call this a derived row because the 2 hexachords are the same, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and also 0, 1, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, these are basically the chromatic hexachords. So that's, no duh that they'd be complements of, or they'd be the same hexachord. But again, I usually do not call it derived unless either it's built out of the same trichord or the same tetrachord. But one thing that we start to notice is that the second hexachord is the retrograde of the first hexachord transposed by a tritone. In other words, this second hexachord is the R6 of this hexachord. And what's even cooler, vice versa, because, of course, the tritone, or 6 semitones, is symmetrical. It cuts the octave in half. It's a half of 12. So either way, if either one of these is transposed by 6 semitones and reversed in order, we get the other one. Okay? Now that has some interesting results. One of them is, and Dr. Hicks mentioned this, is this actually reduces the number of unique row forms, because if I take the P0 and I revert and I transpose it up or down, it's the same thing, by 6 semitones, and I reverse the order, in other words, retrograde it, that is the R6. This means that the R6 should be the same as the P0. So let's test this out. Okay, P0 would start, let's blow this up a little bit. P0 should start here and go across. And R6, well, here's 6, so the R starts here. Okay, A, F sharp, G, let's look at the P0. A, F sharp, G, G sharp, E, F, G sharp, E, F, B, A sharp, D, B, A sharp, D, C sharp, C, D sharp, C sharp, C, D sharp. Voila. So, and we're going to find that we could take any row form and take its R6, and it's going to be the same row form. Let's take one at random. Okay, how about I10? G, A sharp, A, blah, blah, blah. This is I10. Well, what's the R6 of I10? In other words, we transpose it by 6 semitones and reverse it. We could either add or subtract 6 from 10. That's going to give us 4. Same thing. Okay, so we want the RI4 and the I10. RI4 is going to be right here. Let's look at it. G, A sharp, A. G, A sharp, A. G sharp, C, B. Where am I? G sharp, C, B, etc. Those are the same row forms, just different titles. The cool thing is the second movement of the symphony is a set of variations. And one of the variations, Webern takes advantage of this, and he messes everything up. He makes it almost impossible to 12 count, because almost every collection of sequence of pitches could be 12 counted multiple different ways. And so he kind of defeats the smug analyst who would like to figure out what row forms he used. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Again, and I've put in the number matrix just to show you there's this alternative way of doing matrix using numbers. If we assign A as 0, which we have done here, then we can give this matrix from 0 to 12. 0 is A, B flat is, A is 0, B flat is 1, B is 2, C is 3, etc. Now this gives us some advantages. If you're very mathematically oriented, you can do a lot of things with this type of matrix that you can't do with this matrix. But we're not going to worry about that here. If you were to take a graduate class in theory, you might work more with this type of matrix. Anyway, okay, let's go see if there are a few other ideas that we want to look at. Now, the other really cool thing about this is I've put this here, and you remember that the piano variations was drawn from, now I can't even remember how many notes it was. Anyway, a limited pitch gamut. Well, this is even more limited. In fact, there's only one pitch per pitch class. In other words, the 12 pitch classes are fixed, with the exception, and they're all they have equidistant partners on the other side of this A3. So, you know, B flat, A flat. So he's cleverly figured this out. How do I do this so that I only have to have one pitch position, one octave position for each pitch class, and I have this inversional symmetry around this A axis. The only thing he can't do that with is E flat, because E flat, you know, 6 semitones up from this A, also 6 semitones down from this A. So in other words, there are actually 13 pitches in this, again, the exposition of the symphony. So we don't have time to do this, but if you wanted to, we went through all the notes on this page of this score, you would find they're only these. These are the only pitches that appear on this exposition of the symphony. So that again contributes to, well, it makes it possible to have this inversion canon, have 2 inversion canons, and it contributes to this very transparent, eerie kind of texture. Okay, let's see if there are other ideas. Well, I want to show you one thing that's not on the worksheet or the packet, and that is the first part of the development section of this piece is retrograde symmetrical, not just in terms of you know, pitch class, but in terms of pitch and instrumentation. And I'll try to demonstrate. We start from this event here, and then we will go, you'll notice that we go to a certain point, and then the piece starts to go backwards. It's symmetrical. It's a palindrome. That's where Dr. Hicks had that page about palindromes. This is a musical palindrome, very unusual. And of course, the unique nature of his 12-tone row being actually sort of retrograde symmetrical itself makes this fairly easy to pull off. But let's listen to that, see if you can hear. I'll try to point out when we get to the center point. So let's listen to a little of that, or this section. Here's the center point right here. That's the center point. Now we're going backwards in the palindrome. You'll notice that. Okay, I believe we've finished that palindrome. Okay, so that's a kind of a famous passage that's retrograde symmetrical, not inversionally symmetrical. There may be inversional symmetries there, actually, I have no idea. Okay, then Dr. Hicks talks about, or no, I talk about, well, the other part of this score excerpt is from the second movement, which is the theme and variations. Now this theme doesn't look or sound much like a normal theme. I shouldn't use the word normal, but whatever. But what's interesting about this is we have these two row forms. And of course, isn't that interesting? We could also call this what the RI2 or the RI8. I mean, they're exactly the same. But anyway, we've got this melody sort of in the clarinet and then accompanied by these other instruments. And you'll notice that this is itself a palindrome. Here's the center point, But the interesting thing about this palindrome, of course, it mirrors the R6 equivalency of the row itself, meaning that, like in the previous passage I played for you, in this middle it starts to go backwards. You'll notice we have this note in the clarinet, and then we've got this major seventh going down here, major seventh going up, then we have this note in the clarinet, blah, 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 then we have these two harmonics in the harp, blah, 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 and then what's good, these are horns right here in major sevenths, blah, 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 and then we have these two harp notes here. So it's again, symmetrical from this axis of symmetry going backwards and forwards. However, the second half is transposed by a tritone. But the tritone itself is symmetrical. So it's an interesting, additional symmetry. Plus, these row forms are, of course, a tritone away from each other, which is kind of cool. Let's listen to that. And this is where you can hear one thing that I should say. Schoenberg said some interesting things lots of interesting things, but in his writings he talked about different ways of varying a motive or a theme, and of course some of them were ones that he used in the 12-tone method, specifically inversion and retrograde. He talked about other ones, expansion of intervals or contraction of intervals and increasing of values and decreasing of values. But specifically with inversion, he said, well, you can hear inversion. I remember the first piano piece I learned was, "Here we go, up a row to a birthday party." And then the second half was, "Sandman's near, Dolly dear, you will soon be sleeping." It's the inversion, and you recognize it right off the bat. But he said retrograde is almost impossible to hear. And it's true. It's not impossible, but it's a lot harder to hear because we're going backwards in time. With inversion, we're still using the same sort of temporal proportions, but if we're with retrograde, it's much harder for us to imagine time going in reverse. But this piece is this theme is so transparent, and he's controlled so many aspects of what this sounds like that I think we can really hear it, time moving forward and then moving backwards. It's a really interesting sensation. So let's listen to that. Maybe we'll listen to it a couple of times. First, let's listen to it with the full score, and then maybe we'll listen to it looking at the reduction. Okay, here we go. Center. Okay, let's go back and what was I thinking? Okay, so let's listen to it again, and this time let's follow along with this score. Okay, so that's that. So palindrome with the twist of being at the tritone. Then Dr. Hicks has included the coda. We haven't looked at any of the variations, and we won't today. But he has a theme, then some variations, and then a coda. Here again, we've got the I8 and the I2, but in this case, you'll notice that these row forms kind of stayed separate, at least in this representation. One row form was used as the melody, and the other was used as the accompaniment. And I realize I'm contradicting myself about this being pointillism instead of homophony, melody and accompaniment. but I think we do have a melody and accompaniment here. In this case, oops, I just lost everything. What did I just do? Let's go back to, where am I? Oh, there we are. Okay, let's go to this coda. In this case, you'll notice that we have a palindrome again, and the center point is actually a rest, a bar rest. And so if we go from here, from the beginning of the coda to the end, we get the same rhythms, pitches, instruments in reverse order, starting from the end to the beginning. And here's the axis of symmetry, this bar rest. However, in this case, the second half is not transposed by a tritone at all. It's a literal palindrome, like what we saw in the development of the first movement. Now, how did we do that? Well, he's got these two tritone-related rows, and then he actually hacks it. He switches the rows around in terms of, okay, this note or this rhythm and this instrument gets, instead of the I8 note, it gets the I2 note, and vice versa. So he swaps the hexachords around. Of course, the hexachord for, second hexachord for I8 is going to be, let's see, the exact retrograde of the hexachord for I2 and vice versa. I hope that makes sense. Think about it. And I wrote about it on my little worksheet here. I think it's here somewhere. Oh, and by the way, here's an illustration of these, row forms with the index number of 12. In other words, their transposition numbers, being inversely related, and then their transposition numbers adding up to 12 or 0. Okay, so anyway, oh, here it is, the coda. So you'll notice I've given letters to represent durations and instrumentations, and you'll notice that they switch around here, whereas here they go forward and then backwards. Anyway, okay, let's listen to a little of this. Again, we'll listen to it both ways. Okay, let's listen with the full score first. Okay, here we go. Now we're going backwards. Very abrupt ending. Let's go back and listen one more time. Oh man, what was it? Now this overlaps the previous section a little bit, so it's kind of hard to get to the right place. Let's move it back one more second. There we go. Now let's follow along with the reduction score right here. Okay, sort of starting here. Okay, well, I think that's a good introduction to this this piece, and again, these concepts which are kind of important in Webern's music. Symmetry, both inversional symmetry and retrograde symmetry, in other words, vertical and horizontal symmetry. Literal symmetry, okay, this is where Webern differs from maybe some other composers. He was not interested in any properties that were not sort of literal, and then this dyadic invariance, having two row forms and rigging it, the choice of row form pairs so that specific pitch classes are always associated with the other pitch classes. And then, of course, texture, pointillistic texture. So anyway, it's been good. After this, we're going to move on to our final unit about kind of a grab bag of late 20th century, early 21st century musical techniques. Goodbye.